We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1882 and the solemn story of Lord Frederick Cavendish. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people, whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. In the spring of 1882, the political atmosphere in Ireland was fraught with tension. Years of agrarian unrest, known as the Land War, had pitted tenant farmers against landlords, and the British government's response had oscillated between reform and coercion. In an attempt to quell the turmoil, Prime Minister William Gladstone sought a new path of conciliation. His chosen instrument for this policy was Lord Frederick Cavendish, a respected and moderate politician who was also his wife's nephew. On May 6, 1882, Lord Cavendish arrived in Dublin to assume his new role as Chief Secretary for Ireland. His appointment was seen as a symbol of hope, a chance to bridge the divide between British rule and the aspirations of the Irish people. He carried with him the promise of a new, more lenient approach, arriving in a city that was the very heart of the conflict he was sent to resolve. Beneath the surface of Dublin's official life, a far more radical element was at work. A secret society, calling themselves the Irish National Invincibles, had formed with a singular, violent purpose. As a splinter group from more mainstream nationalist organizations, the Invincibles rejected political negotiation and believed that only through targeted assassinations of key British officials could they break the grip of the Dublin Castle administration. Their primary target was not the newly arrived Chief Secretary, but a man who embodied the permanence of British rule in Ireland, Thomas Henry Burke. Burke was the permanent Under-Secretary, the most senior civil servant in the Irish government. With decades of experience, he was considered the institutional memory and operational head of the British administration. To the Invincibles, he was the chief architect of coercion and the symbol of an oppressive regime. For months, they had been meticulously planning his demise, shadowing his movements, and waiting for the opportune moment to strike. On the evening of his arrival, after being officially sworn in at Dublin Castle, Lord Frederick Cavendish decided to walk to his new residence, the Chief Secretary's Lodge, located in the vast expanse of Phoenix Park. It was a pleasant spring evening, and the park was filled with Dubliners enjoying the weather. As he made his way along the main thoroughfare, Cavendish happened to overtake Thomas Burke, who was traveling in a horse-drawn cab. Recognizing each other, Cavendish dismissed his own escort and joined Burke, who alighted from his cab to accompany the new Chief Secretary on the remainder of his walk. The two men, one the fresh face of a new policy, and the other the enduring symbol of the old guard, strolled together, deep in conversation. They were unarmed and unguarded, two high-ranking officials enjoying a simple walk through a public park, completely unaware that they were being watched, and that one of them had been marked for death. As Cavendish and Burke neared the Phoenix Monument, a group of men, members of the Invincibles, approached them. The assassins had been lying in wait for their target, Thomas Burke, and the unexpected presence of Lord Cavendish did not deter them from their mission. The attack was shockingly swift and brutal. The assailants, armed with long surgical knives to avoid the noise of firearms, surrounded the two officials. Joe Brady, one of the lead assassins, attacked Burke,
while others set upon Lord Cavendish, who attempted to defend his companion with his bare hands and a small umbrella. Within moments, both men lay dead on the grass verge. The attackers immediately dispersed, melting back into the evening crowds of the park, leaving a scene of horror in their wake. A passing cyclist was the first to discover the bodies, initially believing he had stumbled upon two drunkards who had fallen. The terrible truth would soon become clear.
The news of the double murder, which would forever be known as the Phoenix Park murders, sent shockwaves across Ireland, Britain, and the world. The act was universally condemned, from Queen Victoria to the Irish nationalist leader Charles Stewart Parnell, who was horrified by the attack and offered to resign his seat in Parliament. The killings were seen not just as a crime, but as a direct assault on the possibility of peace. Gladstone's policy of conciliation lay in ruins, shattered in the same moments that took his nephew's life. In London, the government was thrown into crisis, and a mood of vengeance replaced any thoughts of reconciliation. In Dublin, the administration was paralyzed with shock and fear. The murders had achieved the Invincibles' short-term goal of striking terror into the heart of British rule, but in doing so, they had unleashed a political firestorm that would consume all of Ireland. The Dublin Metropolitan Police were placed under immense pressure to find the killers. The investigation was led by Superintendent John Mallon, the head of the Detectives Division, and a man renowned for his skill and determination. The initial investigation, however, yielded almost nothing. Phoenix Park had been filled with people, yet few witnesses came forward, and those who did provided vague and contradictory descriptions. A formidable wall of silence, built from a combination of fear and nationalist sympathy, confronted the police. For months, the investigation stalled. The British government, in its frustration, passed the Prevention of Crimes Act, a severe piece of legislation granting the police sweeping new powers of arrest and interrogation. Despite hundreds of arrests and a massive reward offered for information, the identities of the assassins remained a mystery, and the Invincibles seemed to have committed the perfect crime. The breakthrough in the case came not from the streets, but from within the ranks of the Invincibles themselves. In January 1883, 8 months after the murders, Superintendent Mallon's painstaking work finally paid off. He arrested numerous suspects, including a man named James Carey, a city councillor and a key organizer within the secret society. Facing the prospect of the gallows and tempted by a government offer of immunity for anyone who would provide evidence against the ringleaders, Carey made a decision that would seal his comrade's fate and his own. He agreed to become an informer. In secret testimony, Carey laid bare the entire conspiracy. He named the men who had planned the attack and those who had carried it out, providing the authorities with the detailed, first-hand account they so desperately needed. His betrayal blew the Invincibles' conspiracy wide open and handed the prosecution the key to solving the case. James Carey's testimony led to a series of sensational trials that gripped the public's attention. With Carey as the star witness for the Crown, the wall of silence was broken, and the state's case became unassailable. One by one, the men he implicated were brought to the dock. The evidence he provided was chillingly detailed, outlining the planning, the motive, and the execution of the plot. Despite their defiance in the courtroom, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. 5 members of the Invincibles, Joe Brady, Daniel Curley, Michael Fagan, Thomas Caffrey, and Tim Kelly were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Between May and June of 1883, they were all hanged at Kilmainham Jail. The trials had brought what the government considered justice, but for many in Ireland, the executed men were seen as martyrs, while the informer, James Carey, was reviled as the ultimate traitor. Having secured the convictions, the British government fulfilled its promise to James Carey. Under a new identity, he and his family were secretly put on a ship, the Kinfounds Castle, bound for a new life in South Africa. But the reach of Irish nationalism was long. On board the same ship was a man named Patrick O'Donnell, an Irish bricklayer from County Donegal who had spent time in America. During the voyage, O'Donnell discovered Carey's true identity. On July 29, 1883, off the coast of Cape Town, O'Donnell confronted Carey and shot him dead. The Avenger was swiftly arrested, sent back to London for trial, and despite a significant public campaign for clemency in Ireland and America, he too was convicted of murder and hanged at Newgate Prison. The cycle of violence that began in Phoenix Park had reached its bloody conclusion thousands of miles away, demonstrating the passion and bitterness the original crime had inspired.
The Phoenix Park murders cast a long and enduring shadow over Anglo-Irish relations. The immediate effect was the death of Gladstone's conciliation policy and the implementation of harsher coercive measures in Ireland. In the longer term, the murders deeply damaged the cause of Irish Home Rule. They armed political opponents in Britain with the argument that Irish nationalists were inseparable from violent criminals, a smear that would taint the political process for years. The event became a dark and pivotal moment in the struggle for Irish independence, a tragedy born of desperation that ultimately set back the very cause it was intended to serve. The story of Lord Frederick Cavendish and Thomas Burke is a solemn reminder of how a single act of political violence can alter the course of history, leaving behind a complex legacy of martyrdom, betrayal, and unresolved conflict. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.